Anne and Wentworth, a Persuasion Prequel variation by Samantha Lord. Chapter 2. Everyone said that Captain Frederick Wentworth was remarkably handsome, and Elizabeth agreed. She had caught a glimpse of him when travelling through the village of Monkford, and was determined to secure an introduction. Sir Walter was askance. "Are you mad? He is a sailor brother of Mr. Wentworth, the curate of Monkford." A sailor, a curate! For the daughter of Sir Walter Elliot of Kellynch Hall to be introduced to the brother of a curate? It is an indignity not to be borne. This is something I cannot indulge you on, Elizabeth. But, papa, I must have amusement sometimes. It is so very boring when we're not in London. I know we must spend the summer here, as it is sometimes so very hot in town. It is still, however, very tedious only seeing the same people all the time. Of course I know who he is and who I am. I shall make him feel the distinction, I assure you. Anne was in the room when this conversation took place, and she was curious about the young man she had heard so much talk of. She had not yet seen him. "Have you seen him then, Elizabeth? I feel quite remiss that we have not paid our respects. Mr. Wentworth is a very pleasant man, and we should be pleasant to his brother. I have heard that he just came home from being at sea, and has been promoted to the position of commander. I am told this means he is now called captain." "At sea? Oh yes, he is of the navy. I have great objections to the navy. I imagine he has skin like shoe leather. They all do," responded Sir Walter haughtily, flopping down on a chair in a way only the best gentlemen can. Anne was silent. Elizabeth, however, was reluctant to be quiet. Knowing her father's special affection and preference for her, and his propensity for indulging her every whim, she continued, "Come, papa, it is only arranging an introduction. I promise I will never ask you to meet him or his brother," Elizabeth explained, almost laughing at the thought. "No, Elizabeth, it is regrettable that you are bored, but it is an extremity I will not descend to. If you wish to meet the curate's brother," he said, sneering, "you must arrange it yourself." Elizabeth was never one to be put off a plan of her own devising. As soon as her father said she must find a way to be introduced herself, never imagining that she would go ahead with such an imprudent plan, she decided this was exactly what she would do. It was the next day when she startled Anne by speaking to her for the first time in weeks. "Anne, I wish to go into Monkford tomorrow. Will you accompany me? It is so dreary here at the moment. So many of my friends have married and left. So I suppose I must ask you to come with me. Of course, it would be entirely out of the question for me to go alone." Anne felt less than enthusiastic about going anywhere with Elizabeth, especially as her sister seemed so resistant to spending time with her. She felt restless as well, however, and she wondered if perhaps spending a morning with her sister on an excursion would bring them closer. Poor Anne was dreadfully lonely at Kellynch. "Very well, I would like that. What time shall we set off?" Anne asked. "Oh, immediately after breakfast. I have already written to Mr. Wentworth at the Monkford parsonage to tell him we are coming. There is really no need for introduction when meeting us would set him at so great an advantage." "Are you quite sure, Elizabeth? But what if he already has an engagement? As a clergyman he is sure to have many duties with his parishioners," Anne asked, rather askance. "Oh, that is nothing. He would be a fool not to seek the acquaintance of any of the Kellynch Hall family. I am sure he is quite nervous and preparing his humble sitting-room as we speak." And so the plan was settled, and the next morning the two young ladies set out. Monkford was only a few miles away, and Anne and Elizabeth made their way in one of their father's grand carriages. This splendid sight drew the stares and admiration of the villagers, and Elizabeth felt more than a little regal. Anne, on the other hand, only felt embarrassed. As far as she could fathom, she and her sister had no business visiting a man to whom they had not been introduced, not to mention his brother. What on earth would these young gentlemen think of her? She knew her father would object to her referring to these men as gentlemen, as they were not landed. They did not own land and property. This to Sir Walter made them beyond the pale. Anne, however, more sensible and considered than her parent, knew that Mr. Wentworth and his brother were educated men, and she had heard admirable things about their affability and honour. Elizabeth heaved exasperated sighs as they drew up the drive before the Monkford parsonage. This was really too much. It was a very small house, much more so than many other more respectable parsonages she had seen. Curiosity rather than politeness, however, made her determined to proceed with the visit. Anne thought the house a very pleasant and cosy little cottage, and a haughty thought did not pass through her mind. She could only imagine her father would need a rest on his chaise lounge and more than a few whiffs of the smelling salts before he could ever be admitted into such a humble abode. Mr. Wentworth's maid, a smiling girl of about 15, greeted them at the door and showed them in. She led them to the house's sole parlour, where Mr. Wentworth and his brother, Captain Wentworth, were already seated. The two gentlemen politely rose as soon as the young ladies were announced. Bows and curtsies of the most cordial and friendly variety were exchanged. Miss Elliot and Miss Anne Elliot, the maid pronounced, as the two young ladies stepped quietly into the room. As usual, Elizabeth could not hide her disdain for the surroundings she found herself in. She gave a stiff smile that was polite but only just. Anne, by contrast, was quite enchanted with the snug little room that Mr. Wentworth called his parlour. It had a hearty fire and comfortable chairs, and more important than that, smiling faces to greet its visitors. Both young men were handsome, the younger one, Captain Wentworth, extraordinarily so. At least so Anne thought. Elizabeth gave a studied appearance of disdain. All these impressions were only the work of a moment. Mr. Wentworth soon bowed and spoke. "Welcome, Miss Elliot, Miss Anne Elliot. I cannot say how honoured I was to receive your letter yesterday." Elizabeth had a knowing look. Anne smiled more broadly. "Yes, welcome," he continued nervously. "Please allow me to introduce my younger brother, Captain Wentworth." Captain Wentworth stepped forward. He was taller than his brother, with dark hair and green eyes that had an unusually intelligent and perceptive look. Anne thought he looked about 23. He gave the impression of having a lively and friendly disposition. For all her modesty, Anne could not help but notice and acknowledge that he looked at her rather longer than might be expected for a new acquaintance. He soon recollected himself and glanced at everyone else in turn. A creak of the floorboards announced the maid re-entering to serve tea. Mr. Wentworth had soon spent the topic of his time at university and parish duties, and his younger brother soon took over the duties of conversation. He regaled the company with tales of his time at sea and foreign ports. "I have recently been honoured with a promotion to the position of commander, and I cannot tell you how pleased that has made me. While I feel myself quite unworthy as yet, I am given the honorary title of captain. As you might know, Miss Anne, it's terribly difficult for young men without firm connections to progress through the Navy as quickly as one would like. It is superior to the Army in that respect, I must admit, but the challenges are still significant. It was the prize I recently took that did the business, but I still have much work ahead of me before I can progress any further with regard to fortune and consequence." "Surely not so distant, Captain?" Anne inquired. "You seem so perfectly fitted for the Navy. I cannot believe that your superiors do not see your worth." She blushed and looked down as soon as these words left her lips, and the rest of the company seemed quite embarrassed. Commander Wentworth's eyebrows raised, but his expression was one of pleasure, not disapproval. The room was silent for a moment. Anne could just imagine the look her sister must be sending in her direction. "I am flattered and honoured by your commendation, Miss Anne. I certainly do try as hard as I can to fit my role. I'm afraid I'm a bit of an idle fellow by nature, so it is quite difficult," the captain said, laughing. "Nonsense," piped up Mr. Wentworth. "I will not allow you to denigrate yourself in that way. For one thing, it is simply untrue. Miss Anne, I assure you, my brother is an extremely dedicated Navy man. Everyone says how perfectly fitted he is for life at sea, and that he is sure to rise high in the ranks." "Well, I must ensure I take more and better prizes on my future expeditions, Henry," Captain Wentworth declared, "and I certainly would not like to disappoint Miss Anne after all her generous praise," he said, looking directly and meaningfully at the young lady. Anne could feel every eye in the room apparently peering into her very soul. She felt like she had nowhere to hide. Mercifully, Elizabeth, hating for the focus to be on anyone other than herself, had lost patience and wished to change the subject. She was also quite annoyed by the fact that the dashing young captain had paid her sister attention instead of herself. "Please tell us more about the Navy, Captain Wentworth. We are also interested to hear," she said.